The gavel struck the wooden block. Judge Samuel Mercer's weathered hand trembled slightly as he delivered the sentence. 20 years without possibility of parole. The defendant's shoulders slumped. A woman in the back row stifled a sob. Mercer avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the papers before him. This court has no tolerance for those who violate the public trust, he continued, voice steady despite the tremor in his fingers. You had opportunities for mercy. You squandered them all. The defendant, a young man with hollow eyes, said nothing as the bailiff led him away. The courtroom emptied quickly, leaving Mercer alone with the echoes of his judgment. Dawnlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floor. Mercer gathered his papers, sliding them into a leather portfolio that had seen better days. Like everything else in this town. Like himself. The old courthouse had stood for over a century, its marble columns and wooden benches bearing silent witness to thousands of judgments. Mercer had delivered more than his share over 30 years on the bench. The building seemed to hold them all, pressed between floorboards and tucked into corners like forgotten ghosts. Mercer walked the empty corridor toward his chambers. Framed photographs lined the wall, younger versions of himself receiving commendations, shaking hands with governors, standing proudly beside his robed colleagues. His footsteps echoed against the marble, a solitary sound in the early morning quiet. His office smelled of old books and furniture polish. A single desk lamp cast a pool of light across stacks of case files. Behind his desk hung a portrait of his father, also a judge, his stern expression a perpetual reminder of duty. Beside it, a smaller frame held a faded photo of a woman and child, faces he could barely look at anymore. Mercer sat heavily in his chair, suddenly aware of the ache in his knees. 58 wasn't old, but he felt ancient this morning. He pulled a flask from his desk drawer, considering it before returning it unopened. Not today. Today required clarity. A single envelope sat centered on his blotter, cream-colored and expensive. He'd been avoiding it for days. The return address belonged to the State Bar Association. Another complaint, perhaps. Another demand for explanation. He left it untouched. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 8. Court would reconvene soon. Another day of judgment, of lives altered by the words from his mouth and the strike of his gavel. The law is clear, he whispered to himself. The law is all that matters. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Come, he called, straightening his posture. The door opened to reveal Martin Grayson, defense attorney and, once upon a time, Mercer's closest friend. 20 years of opposing each other in court had worn that friendship thin. Sam, Grayson said, closing the door behind him. Got a minute? Mercer gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Court's in session at 8:30. Grayson sat, placing a thin file on the desk between them. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than Mercer remembered. You look like hell, Martin. Late nights. This case. Grayson tapped the file. I need to talk to you about the Wilson boy. Mercer frowned. Ex parte communications are inappropriate, counselor. You know that. I'm not here as his attorney. I'm here as someone who's known you for 40 years. Grayson leaned forward. And as someone who knew his father. Thomas Wilson was a good man. Yes. And his son made a mistake. Mercer's jaw tightened. Armed robbery isn't a mistake. It's a felony. He had no record before this. 22 years old. College student. Grayson's voice softened. His mother's dying, Sam. Cancer. He couldn't pay the medical bills. So he held up a convenience store at gunpoint? Mercer shook his head. The law doesn't care why. But you should. Grayson pushed the file closer. Just look at the full picture before you sentence him. That's all I'm asking. Mercer stared at the file but didn't touch it. Justice is blind for a reason. Justice without mercy isn't justice at all. Grayson stood. Remember when we used to believe that? Before you became this. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Court's in 30 minutes, Mercer said finally. I'll see you there, counselor. After Grayson left, Mercer opened the file. James Wilson's face stared back at him, young, frightened, a shadow of his father. Mercer closed it quickly, but not before noticing his hand was shaking again. The courtroom filled slowly. Mercer watched from the bench as the gallery seats claimed their occupants, reporters, curious townsfolk, the family of the accused. James Wilson sat beside Grayson, shoulders hunched in an ill-fitting suit that had likely belonged to his father. All rise, the bailiff called. Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Samuel Mercer presiding. The ritual words, spoken thousands of times, still carried weight. Mercer nodded, and everyone sat. Commonwealth versus James Wilson, he announced. Counsel, Are you prepared to proceed? The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Daniels, stood. Yes, Your Honor. Defense? Grayson rose. Ready, Your Honor. The trial proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Witness testimony. Evidence presented. Objections sustained or overruled. Mercer watched it all with practiced detachment, yet found his attention repeatedly drawn to the defendant's face. Something about the boy's eyes troubled him. Not defiance or anger, but a resigned sadness that seemed to reach beyond his years. When Wilson took the stand, his voice barely carried to the bench. I know what I did was wrong, he said when asked if he wished to make a statement. I was desperate. My mom needed the treatments, and the insurance denied the claim. I couldn't watch her suffer knowing there was something that could help. Did you consider other options? Grayson asked gently. I worked 2 jobs. Applied for loans. Sold everything I owned. Wilson's voice cracked. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. Mercer found himself gripping the edge of the bench. The boy's words echoed uncomfortably in his mind, stirring memories he'd long suppressed. The gun wasn't loaded, Wilson continued. I would never have hurt anyone. I just needed them to take me seriously. Objection, Prosecutor Daniels interrupted. The defendant cannot prove the gun was unloaded at the time of the robbery. Sustained, Mercer said automatically, though the word felt wrong in his mouth. As the day progressed, Mercer felt increasingly unsettled. The evidence was clear. Wilson had committed the robbery, but the circumstances kept intruding on Mercer's usually clear judgment. When the court recessed for lunch, he retreated to his chambers, declining the usual sandwich from his clerk. Alone, he pulled open his bottom drawer, removing a dusty leather-bound journal. It had belonged to Judge Howard Brennan, his mentor during his early days as an attorney. Brennan had given it to him shortly before his death, but Mercer had never found the courage to read it fully. He opened to a random page, Brennan's elegant handwriting filling the yellowed paper. The hardest cases are not those where the law is unclear, but those where it is perfectly clear yet seems to demand an unjust outcome. In these moments, we must remember that we judge not merely facts, but human lives with all their complexities. Mercer turned the page. To judge another is to invite judgment upon oneself. Every sentence I pass reminds me of my own fallibility, my own capacity for error. The gavel is heavy not because it is made of wood, but because it carries the weight of consequences that cannot be undone. Mercer closed the journal, a heaviness settling in his chest. He thought of his own past, of choices made in desperate moments, of Sarah and the baby, of the accident that wasn't entirely an accident, of the cover-up that his father had orchestrated to protect the family name. No one had shown mercy then. No one had looked beyond the letter of the law to see the desperate young man he'd been. When court reconvened, Mercer found himself listening differently. The prosecutor's arguments about deterrence and public safety seemed hollow against the reality of Wilson's circumstances. Grayson's plea for leniency, usually dismissed as emotional manipulation, now resonated with uncomfortable truth. As closing arguments concluded, Mercer announced a brief recess before sentencing. In his chambers, he poured a glass of water with unsteady hands, spilling some onto his desk. The phone rang, startling him. Judge Mercer, he answered. Your Honor, this is Detective Reeves. I need to speak with you about the Wilson case. Mercer frowned. That's inappropriate, Detective. The trial is ongoing. Sir, we've uncovered new evidence. The store owner admitted to tampering with the security footage. The gun was visible in the original recording, clearly unloaded, just as Wilson claimed. Why would he do that? Insurance fraud. He's claiming more was stolen than actually was. The detective paused. The prosecutor's office has been informed. They're preparing an amended filing now. Mercer hung up, mind racing. The clock on the wall showed 11:45. By noon, he would need to render judgment, not just on James Wilson, but on what kind of judge, what kind of man, he had become. The courtroom fell silent as Mercer returned to the bench. The prosecutor approached, handing him the amended filing. He read it quickly, then looked out at the expectant faces. Before I announce my decision, Mercer began, voice steadier than he expected, I want to address something. Justice is not a simple matter of applying law to fact. It requires wisdom to know when the law's purpose is served by its strict application, and when that purpose is better served by mercy. He looked directly at James Wilson. Mr. Wilson, you committed a serious crime. That fact is not in dispute. However, new evidence suggests your claim about the unloaded weapon is accurate. More importantly, the context of your actions reveals a young man faced with an impossible choice. Mercer set aside his prepared remarks. 30 years ago, I sat where you sit now. Not in this courtroom, but in a moment of desperate choice. I chose wrong, as you did. The difference is that I had connections that shielded me from consequences. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Grayson stared at him, recognition dawning in his eyes. The law must apply equally to all, or it applies justly to none, Mercer continued. Today, I choose to apply it with both justice and mercy. He picked up his gavel. James Wilson, I sentence you to 5 years probation and 2,000 hours of community service. You will make restitution to the store owner and complete your education. This court will review your progress quarterly. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Court is adjourned. As people filed out, some confused, others relieved, Mercer noticed a man in a dark suit enter through the side door. He recognized him as the State Bar Association's ethics investigator. The cream-colored envelope on his desk suddenly made sense. By noon, his own name would be on the docket of a different kind of judgment. The investigation into his past that he'd always feared had finally begun. The irony wasn't lost on him, the merciless judge now facing judgment himself. Mercer gathered his robes and walked slowly from the bench. In the hallway, Grayson waited. That was quite a statement in there, his old friend said quietly. It was the truth. Long overdue. The ethics committee? Mercer nodded. They've reopened the investigation into Sarah's accident. Someone came forward. After all these years? Grayson looked troubled. What will you do? Face it. Whatever comes. Mercer felt strangely calm. I've been sentencing others while avoiding my own reckoning for too long. Outside, the midday sun cast no shadows. Mercer walked down the courthouse steps, noticing how the light revealed every crack and imperfection in the old stone. He stopped at the ancient oak tree that had stood witness to generations of justice and injustice. From his pocket, he withdrew the cream-colored envelope, still unopened. He knew what it contained: formal notification of the investigation, charges that could end his career, possibly worse. Yet the weight of it seemed less burdensome now. Kneeling beside the tree, he dug a small hole with his hands, feeling the cool earth against his skin. He placed the envelope inside and covered it gently. It wasn't about avoiding what was coming. Some judgments couldn't be escaped, only faced. But this symbolic burial felt right, an acknowledgement that whatever happened next would be different, that he would be different. Standing, he brushed the dirt from his hands and looked back at the courthouse. Its imposing facade, once a source of pride, now seemed like a reminder of how easily power could corrupt, how readily principles could be compromised. A young woman approached, Wilson's mother, thin and pale but with determined eyes. Judge Mercer, she said softly, I wanted to thank you. He shook his head. Don't thank me for doing what should have been done from the beginning. You gave my son a second chance. That deserves gratitude. We all deserve second chances, Mrs. Wilson. He met her gaze. Even judges. She smiled slightly, then turned to join her son, who waited by a battered car at the curb. Mercer watched them drive away, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, the lightness that comes with truth. His phone buzzed. A message from the State Bar Association, requesting his presence at a hearing the following morning. The reckoning had officially begun. Mercer slipped the phone back into his pocket and began walking. Not toward his car or his empty house, but toward the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town. He hadn't visited Sarah's grave in 20 years. It was time to face the judgment too. The path was overgrown, but his feet remembered the way. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out noon. The hour of judgment had arrived, and for once, Samuel Mercer wasn't afraid to hear the verdict.